Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Biggest Jewish Ideas, Part 2. Tonight's class is Monotheism. So here's the bad news and the good news. The bad news is that people nowadays are not as much into gods as people used to be. The good news is that people are more into the God than people used to be also. So that's a good introduction to try to figure out where we're holding nowadays, and especially in light of tonight's topic, which is monotheism. So what is monotheism, and why is it so important, and how does it affect my life and your life, and why do so many people still get it wrong? Let's define our terms. Monotheism is a very fancy word. Theo means a deity. It means a God. And within the realm of, we're discussing theology. Theology is our understanding of the philosophy about a deity, about a God, about the kind of governance there is, the control there is, the supreme rule there is in the world. So in this doctrine of theology, there are all different schools of thought. Monotheism, mono meaning one, singular, is the belief in one God. Conversely, polytheism, poly meaning multi and many, is the belief in many gods, such as Hinduism and the ancient Greeks and many others. Atheism, a meaning there is none. So it's the belief that there is no God, the denial of a God. Agnosticism is the belief that it's impossible to determine whether or not there is a God. There is pantheism, henotheism, animism. There are many isms, many schools of thought between, I guess, the two extremes of believing in one God versus believing in many gods. And between that, there are many other levels of this faith, as we're not going to get deeply into that because it's not so important for tonight's conversation, but we'll probably allude to that a little bit. So, who does run this world? Who controls the world? How does it all work? Who's the boss of this company? How many bosses of the company are there? What makes everything tick? And in last class, which is part 1, we spoke about creation. We did talk about some of the important ideas that will help us understand tonight better. And if you didn't watch last week's class, you should watch it. But nonetheless, tonight's class you'll be able to understand independently of last week's class. If you look in the history of the world, for the most part, it appears that the world was very polytheistic. Many societies, tribes, cultures, nations believed in the belief of many gods. In fact, there are scholars who want to say that that was the original belief of humankind. It was polytheism. Now, I'm going to disagree with that, as I'll show you in a moment, but let's talk about polytheism. So, a couple examples. Greek mythology definitely believed in many gods, hundreds of gods, that Poseidon was the god of the sea and Zeus was the god of the heavens. We call this the pantheon of many gods, the god of fertility, the god of rain, the god of Parnassah, the god of income, the god of the weather, many gods that you could turn to for blessings, for intervention on your behalf. They say that the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, had 2,000 gods. It is told by the Roman historian Varro that in Imperial Rome there were more than 30,000 gods. You just need to imagine the education in their schools of you have to pass the exam of knowing 30,000 gods. If you don't know about these gods, then who are you going to turn to in a time of need? I mean, you have 30,000 needs. So that is the general culture of polytheism. Different gods who control different parts, different aspects of life, and there are different ways of worshiping each god because each god likes to be worshipped in a different way. And there's many writings about this. Even in the Talmud refers to some of these things. There was one very drastic god, the Baal Peor. The way to worship that god perhaps was to excrete in front of the god, or perhaps it was to enter such a trance of ecstasy, so to speak, that with losing all control of your system and your bowels, you did excrete in front of the god. That's just an example. You served fruit to some gods, and there were many ways. And the thing about the polytheistic life, was that it can get really confusing, I would imagine, because we're almost like trying to petition to one god over the other, and then there becomes these kind of competitive forces between the gods. Not just between us down here, but now whatever's going down here is a reflection of what's happening in the realm of the gods. And I'm appealing for this, and you're appealing for that, and we're having a caucus with each other. I'm turning to my God to help me, you're turning to your God to help you, and our gods have different interests, and which God gets more benefit from me or you. So it can become probably very confusing, and who defines what's right and what's wrong, and are there any such absolute values, which is something that we're going to talk about more later tonight. That is the history of polytheism. And then many scholars will tell you that over a significant amount of time, and perhaps much more recently, relatively, there emerged the belief of monotheism, which was the belief in just one God. And like I said, there are many ways of understanding monotheism, and maybe we'll present a couple of them, but we're going to focus tonight on the Jewish view of monotheism. Now, so if you look, I just read Wikipedia recently to do a quick research. So they claim there that in the year 1766, before the Common Era, which is an interesting date because it happens to be close to, within the vicinity, but about 20 or 40 years, 50 years later, after Abraham was born. And that's significant because Abraham definitely was a discoverer of monotheism. But 50 years later, there is record of, in China, there being this Orthodox faith system by the Shang dynasty, who would worship the Shangdi or Shangdai, which literally means the sovereign above, which was their god. And that may have been a monotheistic faith, or perhaps not, because there were other gods and spirits that were also worshipped together with the Shangdi. A few centuries later, there were some kind of monotheistic faiths in the late Bronze Age, apparently. Then we have record of Zoroastrians in, they say, the 6th century before the Common Era. The Zoroastrians are generally believed to be monotheistic, although, and I had this debate a few weeks ago with somebody who claimed to me that Zoroastrianism was the first monotheistic faith in the world. And I think there are two mistakes about that. Number one, it's not the first. And number two, it's possibly not even purely monotheistic, because they do worship the Ahura Mazda, meaning the maker of all, but nonetheless, they also venerate and possibly worship other Yazatas alongside the Ahura Mazda. I'm not such a Zoroastrian, not at all, and I'm just quoting you things that I've read. So let's get into real monotheism. I think it's safe to say that real monotheism actually is the most ancient faith in the world. And I say that because who were the first monotheistic believers in one God in the world? The very first human beings to live, to be created in this world. Adam and Chava, on the day they were born, which was 5,782 years ago in the Jewish calendar. On the day they were born, we know that they looked around them and they recognized that they were created by this one God, and they turned to all of creation and they said the famous words, which we recite every Friday night in our prayers. It comes from a psalm in Tehillim, which is quoting their words, their song, and they turned to all of the animals and all of creation and they said, L'chu niranana lahashem nariya letzur yisheinu. I doubt they used that tune, but let us all go and sing to the Lord. And let's praise him to the Lord of our salvation. So they definitely were the original monotheists. And they passed that down to their children, I would imagine. But somewhere along the way, through the generations, as we're going to discover soon, that faith gets lost. And the next record is, well, we have several characters in the Torah, even before Abraham. I'm going to get to Abraham because he's an important player here. Noah definitely was a monotheist, and he recognized and communicated with this one God and his children, Shem and Yefes. I don't know about Ham, because Ham was a bit of an outcast of the family. And there are other characters that the Torah describes, Enoch, and then Melchizedek, we had in last week's Torah portion, who may have been Shem, and others who, there was a yeshiva, Shem and Aver, Shem's grandson Aver. There were definitely people in that time, far and few in between, who were still monotheists. And then, of course, the Torah is given eventually, the Jews going down to Egypt. I'm skipping a little bit because there's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their wives and their children were all monotheists, and they weren't really Jews, right? Judaism began at Mount Sinai when God gave us the Torah and said, you be the Jewish people. But before then, they weren't really Jews, but they were the family, the tribe of monotheists. And that was what categorized the Jew pre the giving of the Torah. And apparently in Egypt, the Jews did forget a lot about monotheistic faith. They were very influenced by the Egyptians, and they become idolaters themselves. And then we get to the Exodus from Egypt, and finally the giving of the Torah. And in the giving of the Torah, God comes out very clearly and he says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. And that's in the singular. There is only one God, and that is me. And in this Torah, of course, we have the famous prayer, or the famous verse, Shema Yisrael, listen, O Israel, Hashem Elokeinu, the Lord, our God, Hashem Echad, the Lord is one. Only one. And so that's clear, the Jewish view. And I'm going to read out for you a text from Maimonides. Maimonides describes the principles of Jewish faith. He famously broke down Jewish faith into 13 principles. I'm going to read out for you the second one. And it goes like this. The second principle is the unity of God, may he be blessed, which is to say that we believe that he, who is the cause of everything, is one. He's not like one of a pair, not like one of a group, not like one person that can be divided into many smaller units, and not like a simple body which is numerically one but can be infinitely divided, not one of many. Rather, he, God, may he be blessed, is one in a unity that has no unity like it, singularly one. And this is the second principle, as is indicated by the Torah, and he quotes the famous verse, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. So that is clear. Even though you'll read on Wikipedia or many other scholars who suggest that Judaism only became a monotheistic faith much later, and they actually point to some good sources, because if you look throughout Tanakh, you'll find many generations of Jewish people living in Israel already who are idolaters, right? And kings and Jewish leaders who were idolaters. So, they point to this and suggest that the Jewish community was polytheistic. And only later, in certain times, certain kings who were working hard on behalf of the Torah, later did we become a monotheistic faith. But that is completely incorrect. We were a monotheistic faith since the beginning of time, meaning, like I said, the first Adam and Chava, the first humans. Later, the original monotheist Jews were, of course, Avram and his family, the patriarchs, the matriarchs were all monotheists. And then finally, at the giving of the Torah, it is clear that God cements this idea to us. And we began at the very outset as a monotheistic faith. Now that we've laid that down, just a lot of data and facts and history, I think we need to ask ourselves the following question. Why is this an important debate? Who cares? Why is this important for us to know? What difference does it really make if I worship one God or worship many gods? When I'm asking that question, I'm not asking on a legal sense, right? There's Jewish law about this. The law says you cannot acknowledge other gods. It's considered idolatry and it's forbidden. It's in fact a very severe sin. I get that. But why? Now you could argue because that's the reality. So when we're trying to suggest for you the reality and we're forcing upon you to be educated and acknowledge the reality, why would you live a life of lies? Okay, I get that. But let's study Avraham Avinu for a moment. So Avraham, we always say about him that he was the inventor of monotheism, which, let's just correct that over here, it's technically not true. Like I said earlier, many others before him recognized monotheism, Adam and Chava and their children, and for many generations, and Noah, there were many others. What makes Abraham unique is that Abraham was the first to discover one God without being educated that way, without being raised that way, without receiving it as a family tradition. So previously, it was a family tradition that was passed down, and it wasn't always an unbroken chain, like I mentioned, we'll discover soon. But Abraham was the first to be raised in an absolute pagan society. His father owned an idol store, according to the Midrash. And his father and his family and his community, everybody was worshiping idols and selling idols and buying idols and creating idols. That was all he knew. And then, even in such an environment, Avram becomes the first person to start thinking about this, freely thinking without being influenced by anybody or anything, and suddenly begins to dispel the myths of this polytheistic faiths and to discover monotheism, one God. That's what makes Abraham so unique. So that's actually, we're not taking away from him. I think we're actually adding to his value, or to adding to his his credit of what is so amazing about Abraham. And Abraham goes all out. When Abraham discovers God is one, he puts his life on the line, literally, for that. He abandons his family, he forsakes his family. The famous stories of the Midrash, he smashed all of his father's idols. He may have been a young child, he may have been a little older, depending on which opinion, what age this happened. And then he rejects the common knowledge, the common faith of the society at the time. And he puts himself in grave danger because he is seen as a threat to society. And the king Nimrod imprisons him, arrests him. He's a menace. The things that he's teaching and preaching is destructive to our establishments, destructive to the ruling class. He even threw him into a fire pit, which Avram miraculously survived. So Avram really puts his life on the line. And he could have just said, listen, I'm not going to rock the boat over here. I'll choose to believe in one God. I'm going to keep quiet about it. No, he fights the battles. He's a warrior of God. Why? Why is it so important? Why is it so important to dispel this myth and to tell everybody else they're wrong and to say he's right and to teach this? And the Torah recognizes it. The Torah tells us him and his wife Sarah, they are building a monotheistic faith community. Nefashot asher asu b'Haran. They made souls. They attracted souls. A community in Haran. Many people. They're trying to penetrate into the many layers of society to influence and teach these ideas. Why? Now, I want to share with you a bit of the history of how we got here. The Rambam, Maimonides, in his Mishnah Torah, in his book of law, in his laws of idolatry, uncharacteristically gives us a bit of a history lesson. And this is important for us to keep in mind. And I say uncharacteristically because normally you open up the Rambam's book of law and it is a book of law. Do this and don't do that. And when it comes to the laws of idolatry, he's going to record what's an idol and what's not an idol and what you can and what you can't worship, etc., etc. But before he even begins that, he says, I want to give you a bit of a history lesson. Let me read some of that out for you. So he says, during the times of Enosh, this is several generations into mankind made a great mistake, and the wise men of that generation gave thoughtless counsel. Enosh was one of those who erred. He's going to describe for us, how did things change? Where did we go wrong? If Adam and Chava were the original monotheists and acknowledged and were aware of only one God, at what point did we go wrong? Did everybody start to worship idols and believe in polytheism? So this is their mistake. They said, God created stars and spheres with which to control the world, all the celestial influences. He placed them on high and treated them with honor, making them servants who minister before him. Accordingly, it is fitting to praise and glorify them and to treat them with honor. They perceive this to be the will of God. Blessed be he that they magnify and honor those whom he magnified and honored, just as a king desires that the servants who stand before him be honored. Indeed, doing so is an expression of honor to the king. It's a very interesting idea here. Then they began to build temples and sacrifices to them, etc., etc. Then many years passed, and then things changed for the worse. Let me summarize over here. There's a beautiful midrash. There's a verse in Megillat Eicha, and the verse says, Hashem chelki, God is my portion. So the Medrash asks, what does that mean? Who is saying God is my portion? So the Medrash gives a parable. And the analogy goes like this. There's a king who is entering into a country, visiting a city with his whole entourage. He's accompanied by the duke and the prefect and the commander and many other high-level officials in his administration. Okay? The president's walking in with the secretary of state and the secretary of this and the secretary of that. So the whole crowd is really excited to see all this. So one person says, I want to get close with the duke. I want to get close with the secretary, the treasurer, That's a good connection to have. Another person says, I want to choose the prefect as my matron. I want to get close to these other very high-level officials in the administration. Another person says, I want to get close with the Secretary of State. I want to get close with the Vice President. Right? They're looking for connections. If you have an in, you're connected. You can ask for things, you can receive things, you can influence. Right? But the Medrash says there was one clever person. And that clever person said, I want to choose the king. Because the others are all subject to replacement, whereas the king is not subject to replacement. That is the analogy that the Medrash brings. What is that explaining? It's explaining this point that Maimonides is making. Originally, mankind looked around the world, and they're trying to ask themselves the question, what makes everything happen? What makes the rain come and the sunshine, and what makes the crops grow, and what makes the animal. So they identified various influences in the celestial beings in the cosmos. There's the sun and there's the moon, and there are celestial and there are stars and there are other forces, wind. And they said these things have a lot of force, have a lot of impact as we see, which they do, right? And they said that they're like the high-level officials in the king's administration. So the king is the supreme boss, of course, but the king can't micromanage the company and take care of everything all the time. So he appoints people, and he gives them discretion, it appears, to manage their department. So if you wanted to access the Department of Agriculture, you don't need to go to the king directly. The king is actually not in charge. The king appointed the person in charge, and the person in charge now allocates the budget. Or in the celestial realm, in the God realm, it's the wind, or it's the sun, or it's the clouds, and they're the ones that are deciding, how to treat my field. And probably the king gave them discretion, gave them power. So let me turn to them, not because I'm denying in God, not because the God doesn't exist. The supreme God does exist, but he has given over this power to his, people. That was the original first mistake of the idolaters. What's the first mistake? That they ascribed power to these celestial forces. And this is the difference to the analogy. In the analogy, it's very possible that the duke or the prefect or the secretary of state or the secretary of agriculture actually has power. And you can influence through them the budget and the policy. Whereas in God's world, it's true that God creates a sun and a moon and the wind to influence the tides and the weather and all those things, but they actually don't have any power at all. They are, as the expression goes the teaching goes, "Kigarzan biyad hachotzev," like a axe in the hand of the woodchopper. Who cut down the tree? So the truth is, it's the axe that cut down the tree. Without the axe, you can't cut down the tree. The axe did the cutting. But would you thank the axe, or would you acknowledge or honor the axe for cutting down the tree? The axe didn't have a choice, has no independent being or will or thought. It's just a tool in the hand of the master, in the hand of the woodchopper. So the woodchopper uses the axe to chop down the tree. God uses a sun, a moon, and other things to influence everything around us. But there's no concept, there's no validity to acknowledging or honoring those intermediaries, those tools, because they simply are just tools. But that was the mistake they made. They ascribed power to these beings. Once they ascribe power to these beings and start to worship them with sacrifices and temples, now you're a very small step away through a few more generations of lack of education to completely forgetting about God. Once you're being taught, let's offer a sacrifice to the sun, in the original conversations the parents had with their children, they said, well, God is the real boss, but the sun is what we need right now. At some point in time, we stopped speaking about the God, the real boss, and all that we spoke about was the sun, the moon, and the other celestial beings. And that is the process of how polytheism evolves. Now, I say polytheism evolving because that's an important point. Scholars often point out that polytheism is the original faith system in our world, and monotheism evolved, right? I have a quote here from a text that I read today, and the quote says that there's an evolutionary progression. It began with animism and developed into polytheism, which developed into henotheism, which developed into monolatry, which developed into monotheism. No, that's not how it was. Monotheism was at the beginning of time. Polytheism evolved, and it evolved the way that the Rambam is here describing this to us. And then the Rambam says, then was born Avraham. And after this mighty man was weaned, he began to explore and to think, right? He was only a child, but he began to think throughout the day and the night, how is it possible for the sphere to continue to revolve without anyone controlling it? Who controls the orbit? Who control, right? He saw a sun by day, maybe the sun is the God, but the sun is not there by night. So then it's the moon. But maybe the moon is the God, but it's not there by day. Maybe the sun and the moon are, maybe there's a duality over here. But then he saw that one day the sun blocks the moon or the moon blocks the sun. You have these eclipses. It doesn't make any sense. There's got to be a supreme cause, a supreme being, which is managing and controlling everything in the skies and on earth. That was Avram's thinking, and then he discovers God. Here the Rambam says he discovers God at 40 years old. You may have studied in school that he discovers God at 3 years old, and at 13 years old, and at 18 years old. There are many different opinions. The answer is that it's not a contradiction. There were many stages in his discovery. There's the way he thought as a child, and then he also matured with that. And 40 was, or perhaps 48, there's another number. Another opinion is when he really matured with this idea. And then the Rambam talks about how he sacrificed his life. As I mentioned earlier, he passed it on, him and his wife, to their children, Isaac and then Rebekah, and then Jacob and his wives. The point is, eventually the Jews come down to Egypt, like I said, and then they start to forget about monotheism, except for the tribe of Levi, where they never serve false gods, and then eventually the Jews are redeemed and they receive the Torah, and then Moses puts them back on the correct path, etc., etc. So that's the background. And so the question is, why is this important? There's actually a beautiful text that I prepared here from Rabbi Sachs, alav shalom. We're coming up to his first yahrzeit, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. In one of his articles, he goes through the whole episode of Exodus from Egypt. And we know that God brought 10 plagues against Pharaoh and the Egyptians in order to prepare for the redemption of the Jews. What was the point of these plagues? And there are many commentaries about this. Of course, there was a way to intimidate Pharaoh and to show Pharaoh who's boss, and to completely destroy Egypt, destroy their economy, destroy their resources, to really weaken them as a superpower, so they're going to be pushed against the wall to release the Jewish people. But this is what Rabbi Sachs writes so beautifully. He says, the plagues were not merely intended to punish Pharaoh and his people for their mistreatment of the Israelites, but also to show them the powerlessness of the gods in which they believed. This wasn't just about a power struggle between who's the master and who's the slave, but this was a theological battle. God is trying to rip into the polytheistic faith of the Egyptians, which explains the first and the last of the 9 plagues before the killing of the firstborns. The first was against the Nile, turning the water into blood. The last was the plague of darkness. Now, the Nile was worshipped as the god and the source of fertility. The Nile was this miracle in the desert land that could bring growth, and and then the sun, the source of light, was seen as also one of the greatest of gods, whose child Pharaoh was considered to be son of the sun. And then, so when the Nile is attacked into blood, and when darkness eclipses the sun, this shows that even the greatest of the Egyptian gods could do nothing in the face of the true God. So that's a beautiful, and then he goes into many other plagues as well to describe how they also were attacking the gods, the powers of Egypt. So at the very outset of the Exodus, the Jews are being taught, this is a lesson for the Egyptians, a lesson for the Jews just as much, about the falsehood of polytheism and these forces that they've been acknowledging and worshiping, and really to discover the one force, the one singular force in the world, which is God. Here's the difference between monotheism and polytheism. Monotheism tells us to believe in one God. That's what the Torah, that's what God says to us. Now, we're not going to get into to discuss how we know, how to verify that the communication of God to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, and he said, I'm the Lord your God, that is actually true. That's the story of the Torah, but is there a way to scientifically, sort of historically verify that? Versus many other narratives of other religions where a prophet arises and says, the Lord spoke to me and this is his message, I'm going to build a new religion over here, like many other religions began that way. And the famous idea that the Jewish narrative begins in a testimony about a God revealing himself to 2+ million people. That's a very different narrative than a prophet arising one day and saying, to me alone in my sleep or whatever, God spoke to me and this is the message. So when that happens, that's really not verifiable. Either you buy into it or you don't buy into it, right? But when the story comes out that a God communicated with 2 million plus people, that's got to be true. Because if it wasn't true, how would that myth catch on? Why would you have 2+ million people to buy into that? Someone must have pulled the plug on that one. So, and in that communication, God says, I'm the Lord your God, there's only one God. When you have one God, then we have a value, as we're told in the Torah, that says, man is created in the image of God. When you have many gods, it's the other way around. Then God is created in the image of man. This is a really important idea. How do you come about these many gods? How do you come about these 2,000 Egyptian gods, these 30,000 Roman gods? People created them. Now, people created them, came up with them, designed them and how to worship it. The whole system was man-made. When a man creates a God, you have to be really, really concerned. You have to stay away with a 10-foot pole. Because, think about this. When a man creates a God, what's that? It could be a woman, I'm just talking about a human, a person. When a person creates a God, what are they saying? I'm creating a God for the source of fertility, my friends. Here it is. It may be an object I'm going to create in the shape of who knows what, or it's going to be that animal or that structure or that star in the sky. This is how we're going to worship it. What am I doing? You know what I'm saying? I'm actually saying, friends, I'm the real God. Because I have the power to create this God. And I have the power to dictate or to devise how this God will be, how this God should run. So who's really the God over here? Me. When I grew up, there was a sticker on my fridge at home. I'll never forget it. And the sticker, it's probably still there. And the sticker says, it's the husband talking, and the husband says, I'm the boss of this house. I'm the master of the house. And the first thing I'm the master of this ship, actually. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is watch out for my wife. She's the admiral. It's like somebody who says, I'm the boss of this house and I have my wife's permission to say so. You know that kind of relationship? I'm the boss. Even my spouse allows me to be the boss. So who's really the boss over there, right? There's this, a lot of times, people get very angry with God. Rabbi, I don't like God anymore, or I don't believe in God anymore, because how could God do this and how could God do that, and I did this and God didn't listen and I don't agree with God, like this whole thing, right? Very common. Good complaint, at least you're thinking about it. It's a good question. But I always like to say, the God that you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. That God, the way you're presenting that God, and you're all angry at that God, trust me, I'm not even angry at that God. I don't even believe in that God. That's not the God. When somebody says, I just can't understand God. I can't understand why God would do that. And my response to that is, thank God. I don't want a God that I can understand. If I have a God that I can understand, then guess who's really God? Me. If God has to fit into my intellect and my level of understanding and appreciating and grasping things, then I am the God. I'm just appointing somebody to be the God for me. The point of a God is a God that I don't understand. That's why he or she is a God. And remember, last week we spoke about the relationship or the distance between creator and creation. Of course, it's impossible for a creation to understand a creator. If a creation gets upset, I can no longer understand the creator, therefore I don't like my creator, or I'm stopping to believe in my creator. You know what that's like, to be honest? If you're a computer programmer, this is really true. It's a little bit of a cynical idea, you have to be careful with it, but it's really true. Imagine you're a computer programmer and you programmed a game. I don't know, in my days it was Super Mario. Minecraft, my kids play. I'm not sure how that works, but you're this person in Minecraft and you are building things and defeating and killing, etc. So imagine I have my character in the game, and as I'm playing and I'm pushing the mouse this way and to do this action, all of a sudden, out of the blue, this character turns around to me and says, hey, don't send me left, I want to go right. Or why are you harassing me? Or I want to rest right now. Please don't continue playing the game. I need some rest. Or I don't want to shoot with this gun, I want to shoot with that. Imagine the character turns to you. What would happen? So the first thing I would say is, pinch your cheeks. Are you awake? What have you been drinking? What have you been consuming? That doesn't happen, right? It can't happen because I created you. You just follow the way that you were coded. So it's a similar thing. It's a similar thing to imagine that a creator complains, I don't understand. A creation complains, I don't understand my creator. Thank God. That means you really have a creator. So a God is not there for us to understand. A God is not there for us to be able to put our fingers on and hands around and to control. The person who creates God is the person who's looking for power and control. And the larger they create their God, and the more that they're publicizing their God, the larger they're trying to create themselves. And they're creating God in their image. God is a reflection of them. I want fertility and I want this and I like to do things this way, and therefore I'm going to create God in that image. The system is human run. You never want to be part of a human run system. I mean, you have to be in terms of your company or whatever, but a system that will dictate the truths of life, human run system. I mean, humans are very fallible. Humans are very limited. A human can come up with amazing ideas, but not ideas that are for all people, for all time. Nobody is that brilliant. Nobody can be that brilliant. Everybody can only come up with, subjectively, what they can come up with, which works for them, makes sense to them, but doesn't work for everybody. That's impossible. So a God is, by definition, I don't understand. We have to try to understand God. There's a lot that God tells us about himself, and there's a mitzvah to discover God, which is, by the way, the Rambam's idea that Avraham was 40 years old when he discovered God. Other Midrashim say he was 3 years old, 13. The Lubavitcher Rebbe learns from this Rambam, the Rambam being the chief rationalist, as we know, here is the mitzvah recognizing that the 40-year-old knowledge of God is much more important than the 3-year-old knowledge of God, because as a 3-year-old, it's just faith, blind faith. 13-year-old, but as a 40-year-old, and 40 is significant because that's the age of wisdom in Jewish tradition. So now we're actually really appreciating this God in a very mature way, in a very cerebral way. And there's a mitzvah. We have a big problem in our society nowadays. A lot of Jewish people who have a God that they were taught in Hebrew school, and then when they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, they say, I don't like this, I don't believe in this, it doesn't talk to me. And I say, well, I agree with you. I mean, the stuff that I learned when I was 3 years old or 5 years old doesn't talk to me either. I'm trying to approach things now as a 40-year-old. And when I'm studying and discovering, it's doing a little bit more for me than when it did when I was 3 years old. So as you mature, you have to always advance in your knowledge and pursuit of this. So the Abraham being 40 years old is very significant to constantly pursue a maturer, wiser, deeper understanding of God as much as we can, as much as God allows us. But it's truly going to be impossible. So here's the difference in a monotheistic system to a polytheism. We are created in the image of God. The buck stops with God. He is in control. We have to nullify ourselves. We have to mold ourselves in His image and what He desires and what He wants and what He promotes and the laws that He makes and the values that He decides, they need to become ours. We don't get to call the shots. In a polytheistic system, it's the other way around. This is a very important concept. This leads into a very profound idea in a monotheistic society, what we call monotheistic ethics, or an ethical monotheism. Ethical monotheism teaches us that there's a system of ethics, of values, of right and wrong, and good and bad, and fair and unfair, that is an absolute system. Now let's think about that. What makes something good? What makes something right? And all the time in our lives, whether it's in the matter of law or matter beyond law, the matter of ethics, like what's the right thing to do? And do I want to gossip or lie or cheat and no one's going to know? Or can I behave in a certain way? Can I disrespect? Can I not do, who cares? I'll decide what's right. I'll live the way I want to live. In fact, this is, the way it makes sense to me doesn't make sense to you. Many people might believe, and in fact, in a polytheistic society, it's by definition this way, there truly is no absolute right and wrong. Right and wrong is relative. Is relative based on the gods who were created by the people who created them. So who defines what's right? Who defines when it's okay to kill or not kill? When it's okay to steal or not? When it's okay when we must care for the poor or care for the underprivileged or the weak in society, or we don't need to care for them, they're just weighing us down. All of the values that go into our societies, who decides what's right and what's wrong? Do we just vote on it in Congress? Is that what makes it right or wrong? Is it a majority opinion? And if it's majority opinion, so then we're just saying everything is consensual, human consensual, or it's just relative. And no, we don't believe in that. And when I say we don't believe in that, originally it was a small Jewish tribe who never believed in that. But in today's modern society, it's many more people who don't believe in that. All influenced by ethical monotheism. In monotheism, we don't have any say in how things are, how things were, how things ought to be. We follow the one God who communicates to us through the Torah. And it's that one God who's the creator of the system, of the creator of the product here, who decides what this product is and how it should be used and how it should not be used. There's a rule book, there's a code over here. And so this rule book says many important values and ethics that become binding for all humanity at all times. What are the values that have been binding on all of humanity in all times, in all kinds of civilizations, in all eras? Outside of the monotheistic community, there is no such thing. Look throughout history. Some societies were governed by power, and by wealth, and by strength, and by the aristocratic society. Certain families were more privileged. And what kind of justice was there? What kind of fairness was there? What kind of welfare was there? But by the Jewish people, there was always these absolute values. It didn't matter in which land you lived, it didn't matter in which time you lived. olden days, modern days. We just have to figure out in modern days how to keep adapting and applying the principles, the absolute principles that we believe in, how to apply it in a more modern society way, but they still remain. So I'll give you some examples. First of all, the value of life. The value of life itself. We just said that in monotheism we're taught that all humans are created in the image of God, right? All humans. There's no human that's more in the image of God, or human that's less in the image of God. Nobody's more significant, nobody's less significant. It doesn't go by your IQ, it doesn't go by your age, it doesn't go by which family you're from or your bank account. All of that is irrelevant. If you're a human, God made you. You are precious. Which leads to levels of equality and fairness and justice. And these are all things that we, the Jewish people, or the monotheistic community, always believed in. And we were a fraction of society compared to the rest of the world. For most of the world history, people did not believe in that. Today in America, we take this for granted, a lot of these values, which is silly because it's only very recent, last few hundred years. Up until then, nobody in the world lived that way. It was a foolish way to live because then you lose power and you lose dominance, you lose control. In a monotheistic society, we don't have control. We don't have power. We're all equally subject to the same God, to the same law. Nobody is above that law. Let me read out for you a really beautiful text from the Talmud that talks about how we should behave. And the Torah says, Achrei Hashem Elokechem telechu, you shall walk after your God. What does that mean, to walk after your God? Is it possible to follow the divine presence, the Talmud asks? And then the Talmud says, actually there's a verse that says, Hashem Elokecha eish ochlahu, the Lord your God is a consuming fire, don't get close to the God. So the Talmud explains it's very simple. Lahalech achar midotav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Your behavior needs to reflect and emulate the behavior of your Creator. In other words, your Creator defines for you what is considered appropriate ethical behavior. So for example, God clothes the naked. As we're told, he clothed Adam and Eve. We should also be charitable to clothe the naked. God visits the sick. He visits Abraham in this week's Torah portion. So too you should visit the sick. God consoles mourners, as he did to Yitzchak when Abraham, his father, passed away. So too you should console mourners. God buries the dead, as it says he buried Moses in the land of Moab. So too you shall bury the dead. Primary mitzvot of chesed, of kindness in the community, taking care of others, making sure everyone's needs are met. The impoverished and the poor are not treated any differently than everyone else. To the contrary, every community needs to set up structures where they can provide for and support everyone in the community. These are basic ways of how we must behave. Elsewhere, a Midrash says you have to walk in God's ways. What does that mean? Just like God is merciful and graceful and slow to anger and abundant in mercy and truth, keeping loving kindness for thousands, forgiving transgression, etc., etc. Those are all values of God. Well, if you want to be godly and behave that way, you too need to live like that, which means you need to be compassionate and gracious and slow to anger and kind and loving to everybody, etc., etc. That's what the Midrash says. This is the way you live if you're a monotheist believer. This is the way you must live. This is the way all humans must live. That's a definite right from wrong. If you're not a monotheistic believer, first of all, if you're a polytheistic believer, or if you're an atheistic non-believer, who decides what's right and what's wrong? Every generation can decide something else. Every vote can vote on something else. Every person technically could decide what's right and what's wrong. And I feel different than my neighbor about something, and they feel what I'm doing is immoral, unethical, and I say, no, it's moral and ethical. And I can get into millions of examples, but you know better than I do about examples of this. I want to share one last really big idea, and perhaps I would call it the biggest idea of monotheism. But before I do that, just to wrap up this conversation, look at the influence that the Jewish people, the original monotheistic believers, look at the influence they've had on the world. Literally the world. I'm sitting here in the United States of America, and if you're sitting in democratic countries today, somewhere around the world, that is listening to what I'm describing about normal values and is saying, well, our country believes in that also. Well, of course your country does now, because it's been liberated through the past few centuries in this way. Here is what second president in the United States, John Adams, once wrote. He wrote this to, I believe, a friend of his. He wrote, "I will insist that the Hebrews have contributed more to civilized men than any other nation. If I was an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. They are the most glorious nation ever to inhabit this earth. The Romans and their empire were but a bubble in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern." So yes, when the shapers of the British democracy or the French Revolution or the founding fathers of America, every single one of them was deeply aware of, studied the Bible, aware of the Jewish story, and took lesson from that notebook, right? Even in the US Declaration of Independence, right? Look at the words that secular people came up with, that in the history of the world, for this to be authored into defining the declaration of a nation is unheard of, and that's what's so revolutionary about it. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." You've got to be meshuggah to create a country like that, because you lose all control and power, and because that means everybody is important, even those with lower IQ, less money, really unhealthy, and those that are a pain and a drain on society. But yeah, it's the truth. It's the truth, because we didn't create God in our image. We are all created in the image of God. One last thing, and I hope you've got your thinking hats on, because this is the biggest idea. There's actually a piece of monotheism that we haven't talked about that is the most important idea. Monotheism is actually not about believing in one God. That's incorrect. Monotheism is believing that there is only one thing, and that one thing is God. I want to explain that. The Torah says, straight from the Torah, "V'yadata hayom," you should know today, "V'hashivota el levavecha," know as clear as day, and restore this knowledge in your heart. "Ki Hashem hu Elokim," the Lord is God, "B'shamayim mima'al," in the heavens above, "Ve'al ha'aretz mitachat," and in the land below. Ein od, there is nothing else other than God. You could translate it as "en od," there is no other God, but it's much more than that. In the heavens above, in the world here, around the whole, there is only God. Meaning, it's not that there's God, who's the God of our world, and our world is something separate from God. No, everything is God. Not that everything is a God, heaven forbid, because then there'd be many gods. Everything is just a part of the one God. This is a very deep concept, which we're not going to get into right now all the way, but we're just going to outline it and try to explain it briefly so you can come with some important points. If you recall, in the last class we spoke about creation, and we were talking about how does God create? How does the infinite create the finite? How does the infinite create space and existence for the finite? And we brought the analogy of the throwing stone or the throwing of the bottle it was last week. And we said that when you create something or do something unnatural, right, a bottle will naturally fall, but it won't naturally go up. For it to go up, I've got to put energy into it. And for it to remain up, I've got to keep putting more energy into it, which means when you create something unnatural, you have to constantly, perpetually feed it with fuel for it to be. For the moment that you stop feeding it with that fuel, it'll cease to be. And that described for us creation in general. God perpetually creates. There's this godly animating force of creation that is constantly being injected into all of reality, making it be. Not that we've created it and then God walks away. That would suggest that this being now exists independently of God, and that is not true. Nothing can exist independently of God. There is a spark, there's a force of godliness in this item, from this bottle to this table to that chair to this blade of grass to that mineral to that grain of sand to me to my clothing, everything that exists. And there's that force of God in it at every moment saying, be, be, be. And if that force wouldn't be there, it would disappear. It wouldn't be. Which tells us that when it is, what is it really? It's not really a chair. It's a creative force of God being in the form of a chair. The chair is not God. The chair is just a product of and a part of God. So when we say monotheism, we're not saying there's only one God, but there's only one thing which is God. In a way, when you say there's only one God, you're being somewhat polytheistic also, because you're suggesting there's a God and then there's me. No, there's only God. This tells us something really important. A lot of times we suffer from worry, anxiety. Why? Because we're not sure how this thing is going to play out. And will this thing work out? And why is this happening to me? And there's this force that's coming against me and creating this difficulty and this challenge and this obstacle in life. And a lot of times you can live with the mindset that this clash of forces going on in life. I'm trying to succeed in something and there's a force out there that's stopping me. And then there's this illness being sent my way, which is really stopping me from being this. And so life is a mess. And this was the mindset of the polytheists, where there's this clash of forces all the time. Different gods are battling: the god of success, the god of failure, the god of fertility, the god of love, the god of breakup of love, the god of money. And they're all piecing together who's going to win, who's going to be able to defeat the other, and I'll win, and when I win, you lose. When you win, in a monotheistic model, everything comes from one source. There is only one source in the world, and that is God. And it's God who creates, decides, designs, plans everything. There is no such thing as competing forces, competing circumstances in the world. That's impossible. That means the world is a mess. And the world is not a mess. The world is very organized, perfectly organized by a perfect creator. I don't understand it. I'm not perfect. If I understood it, I'd be saying that I'm as perfect as God, which would mean I could be the God, and then I don't need the God anymore. That's not what a monotheist says. A monotheist says, I don't understand. This is not making any sense to me. I planned for this, and it happened this way. I thought my life could play. I planned, and I was reasonable, I was responsible, and then everything broke loose. Yeah. There's a plan. Everything in this world makes 100% sense. There's a plan. You don't know it. But if you live with this faith, you live like a different person. You live with a calmness. You live with an acceptance. You live with an assuredness, a certainty, a kind of conviction. Not that it should breed laziness or negligence. I'm just going to fold my hands. Nothing I can do has any impact anyhow, and let just life play out in front of me. No. This God says you can't do that. This God says you need to partner with Him. You need to make an effort, you need to get up, you need to try to live your life as best as you can. But recognize that you are just a piece of the puzzle. So I'll tell you a story. There used to be a great rabbi, a very prominent rabbi, and author of many books. He was, I think, a conservative rabbi, Rabbi Herbert Wiener. You may have heard of some of his books. I think he was in New Jersey. And in the 60s, he had a few private audiences with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was very fond of him. He would ask him questions, seek his counsel. And he once showed up for his, I think, 1 a.m. meeting with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe was still a little tied up with other guests. And so he went into the study hall where there were boys who were studying and learning, and he wanted to sit down and he talked with them. He was curious, what are you learning? What are you into? And he had a conversation with them. Later, when he had his audience with the Rebbe, he told the Rebbe, with all due respect, I want to ask you a question. I want to give you a compliment and then ask you a question. Before this meeting, I was meeting with some of your students, and we were talking and they're learning, and I found them to be knowledgeable, bright, educated, well-mannered, polite. You're doing a good job. They're fine young men. But I have a question. My question is that I couldn't help myself. I was looking into their eyes. And in their eyes, I saw what one could favorably say is a kind of tmimut, a kind of purity, but I suspect that it's more like a sense of simplicity and naivete. There's a lack of sophistication, a lack of complexity. They're not getting a well-rounded education with a secular education and a scientific education, and they're not being presented with all different views of the universe, and they're just being molded in this very monolithic way of the faith they have. And he was challenging the Rebbe that this is not allowing them to maturely grow and be sophisticated. The Rebbe told him, Rabbi Wiener, what you see is not simplicity or naivete in a negative sense, but rather what you're not seeing is a kera in their eyes. He asked the Rebbe, what's a kera? A kera means a split. He said, what do you mean, Rebbe? So the Rebbe told him, Mr. Wiener, would I be correct in assuming that you have difficulty sometimes sleeping? He said, yes, Rebbe. And the Rebbe said, many people nowadays have difficulty sleeping. And a lot of times it comes from being disturbed and being in a state of worry and anxiety and things which get to us and put us in very high blood levels, and we're not able to calmly, with conviction and faith, just accept and live with the flow of life, but rather we're really tormented by many things. And it doesn't allow us to sleep. And then if we're not sleeping well, we're not healthy. If we're not healthy, it definitely shortens the years of our life. We won't live out our years as they should, and the quality of our life is never as it should be. And the Rebbe went on and on. The Rebbe said, my students don't suffer from that. My students live with conviction. They know the truth. And therefore they live calmly, confidently, hopefully, not because they have all the answers, not because life is perfect for them, not because everything is rosy, but because they recognize that there's one God who controls everything. I asked in the question on Facebook earlier today about a passage in the Talmud. The Talmud says, and we'll conclude with this teaching, the Talmud says, Kol ha'ma'arich be'echad, when you're saying the Shema is the faith prayer, the faith in God, one God prayer. So, Kol ha'ma'arich be'echad, when you're saying the word Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, the word Echad, the Lord is one. If you lengthen Echad, God will lengthen your days and your years. What does it mean to lengthen Echad, and why does it lengthen your days and your years? So I mentioned that, if you go to many synagogues, you'll often see people who do like this. They do Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. They're lengthening their Echad. No, I'm sorry, that's wrong. That's not what the Talmud means. The commentaries explain this. I'm not making this up. First of all, you have to be very careful about saying the chet, the cha, too long, because if you say the echad too long, it may become two different words. Ichad, which actually means this God is not one. Or it may become a word echad, and it becomes two words. It's not echad, it's echad. It's one word, one God. The dalid, the last letter is not d. D would be the shava underneath it that makes it into a shava na, a moving shava with an active sound. No, it's the final letter of a word, so it's like a silent letter. So you can't say d. You have to be careful about pronouncing the dalid, because if it's not a dalid, it could become a resh, right? The dalid and the resh look similar. Heaven forbid, you don't want it echad to turn into acher. Acher means another. Hashem echad means there's another. Hashem acher means there's another God. No, there's no other God. There's only one God, Hashem echad. So you have to be very careful about pronouncing the dalid, and careful not to mispronounce the ches to turn it into two words or mispronounce the word. You have to be careful to pronounce this word properly. Echad. The idea of lengthening, though, is, as the commentators explained, lengthening in meditation. What is the meditation you have when you say the word echad? The daled means four, the numerical value of four. The God who is the orchestrator of all four directions of the world. The chet, the numerical value being 8. The God is the orchestrator in the heavens above, 7 heavens above, and the 1 earth down here. The Aleph at the beginning of the word represents God, 1. So the Aleph, the one God, is in control of the heavens and the earth in all 4 directions. Meditate on that. Think about that. There's even a ruling in Shulchan Aruch, it's a custom, that your bodily posture should mimic that as you're thinking about that. So when you're saying echad, you should actually move your head in 6 directions, left, right, forward, backward, up and down, which could stimulate the meditation. If you would spend some time every day deeply thinking about that monotheistic meditation, there's only one God, which therefore means there's only one thing, and that everything in this world is a part of God. And you would see God in everything. God's plan is playing out. God's intention is playing out in my life. I'm not a mistake. I'm here because God loves me, needs me, turns to me. Nobody's a mistake. Nothing is a mistake. No circumstance is a mistake, fortunate or unfortunate. I may or may not understand, but at least I know that everything is for a purpose. Everything is leading towards a goal. I hope it's my goal, but it might not be my goal. It might be God's goal for me, but I have to do my best. If you would meditate about that every day, your years and days would be lengthened. What does that mean? Why is it the lengthening of days and years? Some commentaries point out that there's quality and quantity of life. Certainly your quality of life will be enhanced. You'll live with conviction. You'll live with calmness. You'll live with peace, with serenity. You won't be tormented. You won't be full of doubt and fear and anxiety and anger. These are toxic emotions. A monotheistic believer can never get angry. Angry? Why would you get angry? Angry means that what happened should not have happened. Really? Who's controlling this world? Are you God? If you get angry, you're saying that you're God. That's what the Talmud says. When you get angry, you're an idolater. Otherwise, if you're not God, and there is a God, then why are you getting angry? You think something happened without the approval of God? Something that happened is stronger than God? That's for sure not monotheistic. That's polytheistic. You would never get angry. You'd never get afraid. You would never get worried or anxious. I'm not talking about medical conditions that people, I'm talking about faith conditions. People that are monotheistically challenged. That's a condition. That's an ailment that we need to work on. And then the days and the years of your life are truly lengthened. It is pure data. This is medical data. People who live with calmer, more peaceful, more serene dispositions, generally will live longer. People who live with more toxic, negative, bitter, frustrating emotions, it wears you down. It physically wears you down. And you become more vulnerable, your immune system is low, you're just not going to survive that long. That's a fact. So yes, meditate on echad. Think about echad every day. Morning and night, by the way. That's the mitzvah of the Shema. Why? Because number one, it's the truth. Number two, a life lived this way, which is the ethical life, is the real life. And it's the life that's lived this way throughout all times, all ages, all people. It's what creates a real, truthful society and life. And number three, it's good for you. It's healthy for you. It'll give you more years in life. It'll give you better quality of life. You'll be a happier person. You'll have a more enriching life. So that, my friends, is monotheism. And I hope I've covered a number of things. This is
the tip of the iceberg. We could go on and on, but it's really important to think about this and to study about this more and more. It's the truth, and it's good for us. So, thank you for joining, and we'll see you next week for another big Jewish idea. And in the meantime, have a good night, stay safe, and God bless you.